Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Jenna got out of bed, wrapped herself in a robe, and went to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror, her hair a little disheveled, a few wrinkles around her eyes that she hadn't noticed before, and the slight pallor of her face after a short nap. Outside the bathroom door, someone ran with small flopping steps. It was her son, Joy, who had just turned 6. A little farther away, the voice of a 4-year-old daughter, Stella, could be heard capriciously demanding that she be poured orange juice without pulp. She had a beautiful family. Nate, though not the hero from the cover, seemed the epitome of dependability. Hands calloused from construction work, always smiling and kind, ready to caress his wife and support her in any endeavor. Her children, though noisy, were the center of the universe for her. But in a strange way, Jenna began to feel that life had become wrapped up in worries. Diapers, school mornings, endless trips to the store for groceries, and renovations to the family home that she herself had little involvement in because men are better at it. She was 34, but sometimes it felt like she was in her 40s. The day Courtney's friend had suggested a girls' party on a rented yacht, Jenna had somehow immediately felt a surge of energy. "You deserve a reboot," Nate told her when she voiced the idea, and she happily agreed. The kids would stay home with their dad. She wouldn't have to worry about who would cook dinner. It's just one day and one night away from the domestic routine, in the company of close friends Courtney, Vivian, Emma, a couple other mutual acquaintances she knew in passing. "Mom, aren't you going away for a long time?" Joy asked at breakfast. "No, baby, just for one day. I'll be back tomorrow morning," she said, patting him on the head. Nate smiled, as if assuring his son that everything was under control. But when Jenna went to pack, he followed her and hugged her from behind. She felt his warm hands on her waist. "You just going to relax? Nothing wild, right?" he asked almost jokingly, but there was a hint of slight concern in his voice. "Of course, darling. Just us girls and champagne. Maybe we'll go swimming, sunbathe. That's all." He kissed the top of her head and left the room, leaving her alone to pack her bag. Jenna, unexpectedly, reached into her closet and pulled out several swimsuits. She thought long and hard about which one to take, the closed, solid-colored one or the bright red bikini she hadn't pulled out in a while. She wanted to feel a little more daring. She chose the bikini. She added a pale blue perio, a flying dress, and sunscreen to her bag. And, as if giving in to an inner impulse, she put in her makeup bag the red lipstick she usually wore only on special dates with Nate, though those events have been few and far between in recent months. She stopped herself. "Really? Who do you want to like you?" flashed through her mind. But she left the lipstick on anyway and smiled at her reflection. Sometimes women needed to feel wanted, even if no one was going to pay attention. As she walked out of the house, Nate looked at her with slightly sad eyes. He hugged her tightly, kissed her softly, and said, "Enjoy. You deserve a reboot." His voice was a little lower than usual, and she felt a slight prick of conscience. After all, she hadn't really done anything wrong. She was just going to a friend's birthday party. And what could possibly be the problem? Marina del Rey greeted her with the glare of the sun on the water and an endless row of snow-white yachts bobbing on the light ocean swell. Jenna stepped out of the cab and felt the salty wind on her face, greedily inhaling the smell of water and gasoline, that strange mixture typical of marinas. Her friends were waiting for her, mostly in light sundresses and wide hats, laughing and lively. Courtney waved from afar. "Jenna, here." The yacht they'd rented for the day was more luxurious than Jenna had expected. 2 tiers, a spacious deck, soft white couches, a refrigerator with drinks, a cabin below. It took her breath away immediately, a mixture of joy, anticipation, and a little naughty impulse. "Are we rich for a day?" she thought to herself. "Girls, this is going to be the best birthday ever," announced Courtney as everyone gathered on the deck. "We deserve some sunshine, some wine, and no work." Laughter, hugs, the first glasses of champagne. It was as if time had sped up. They moved smoothly away from the marina, the water parting with the bow of the ship, the salty spray refreshing their skin. Music played loudly from a loudspeaker. Energetic pop hits were replaced by relaxing tropical motifs. The girls drank to Courtney's health, laughed at old stories, and some of them immediately took out their phones and started posting photos on social networks. Jenna looked at everything with a slight admiration. The world around her suddenly brighter and more carefree. She took a sip of champagne and felt a nice, warm tingle in her head, a sign that she was no longer just a wife and mother, but a woman who could afford to relax. A man appeared on the deck and caught her attention. He was wearing an unbuttoned white shirt, and beneath it she could see swarthy skin and the contours of sculpted muscles. His dark hair cut short on the sides, left neat wavy strands on the top of his head. Slender figure, confident gait. But it was his gaze that caught Jenna's eye first. Direct, calm, with a slight play of amusement. "Ladies, welcome aboard," he said in a soft accent. "I'm Raphael, your captain for the day. If you need anything, drinks, louder or quieter music, fruit, pillows, feel free. I'm here to make sure your vacation is perfect." The girls applauded. Some began to whisper, discussing his appearance. Courtney cast a sly glance at Jenna. "What a captain we have here." Jenna grinned and pretended it wasn't a big deal, but her heart seemed to beat a little faster. Raphael carefully adjusted the wheel, leveled the boat's course, and looked around at the company. A little later, when the boat was more level and the rocking was less, Jenna rose from the couch to walk to the side of the boat and admire the view. She leaned on the railing, watching the sun reflect in the water. At that moment, someone touched her waist, supporting her so she wouldn't lose her balance. It was Raphael. "Careful, it's a little slippery after the splash," he said. She turned her head, their gazes meeting. Quickly, but enough to feel an internal shiver. Raphael removed his hand, smiled slightly, and stepped back, bowing. Jenna exhaled quietly, not quite sure why her heart suddenly sank. He's just being polite, she thought. Of course he's courting clients. It's his job. And yet the feeling that there was something special about him never left her. Perhaps it was his confidence or his soft gaze. Maybe it was his slight Spanish accent, in which she could hear the sounds of a distant, hot world. Or maybe it was the wine and her own weariness with the routine. Hour after hour, the waves lulled the guests to sleep. The air grew hotter, and the wine flowed just as easily and cheerfully. Courtney brought the speaker to the upper deck, turned on the summer hits, and danced, bouncing, with a glass of champagne in her hand. Jenna sat next to her, smiling. She felt the pleasant euphoria dissolving her anxieties. Raphael appeared every now and then with a pitcher of fruit cocktail, then to adjust the music, then to kindly adjust the shade under the umbrellas so that the sun would not be so hot. He joked with the girls, told jokes that sounded especially funny because of his pronunciation. And everyone laughed happily, but Jenna kept noticing that he was looking at her. Maybe it was just her imagination, but every time she felt his gaze warm, assessing, and almost smiled back before she mumbled, "Wait, I'm married." She couldn't forbid herself a quiet shudder, though. Felt the teenage playfulness awakening in herself. She tried to avert her eyes when she noticed he was close, but sooner or later their gazes crossed anyway. In the afternoon, when the heat became unbearable, everyone decided to go for a swim. The yacht stopped in a cozy cove near the rocks. The water was azure and clear. Jenna changed into her red bikini, feeling a mixed feeling of embarrassment and secret pleasure playing inside her. "Hey, check this out," yelled Courtney, sprawling out and jumping overboard into the water. There was a huge splash, then laughter. The girls were jumping and splashing around. Raphael watched from the deck, sometimes encouraging, sometimes helping to pull someone back, extending a muscular arm. Jenna suddenly felt her gaze stop on its own at his ribcage, at the droplets of water that glistened on his skin as he toweled himself off. Damn, she thought. I look like a teenager who's eyeing a guy by the pool. But she couldn't stop. Later, as she went down to the lower cabin to change, barely closing the door behind her, she heard footsteps. She looked through the ajar doorway and saw Raphael walking down the hall. For a moment their eyes met. He saw that she was changing. The bodice of her swimsuit had already been removed, leaving only the thin silhouette of her body, half hidden in the semi-darkness. He seemed to freeze for a second, looking at her. But then a woman's voice came from the deck, calling out to him. And he continued on as if nothing had happened. And something flashed through Jenna's mind. She wanted to go back to the deck as if she hadn't seen anything, but her heart was pounding and a strange warmth was growing in her chest. It's just flirting. He doesn't even know I'm a mother of two, Jenna said to herself, pulling on a light dress. She tried to dismiss it as normal, but her subconscious was telling her otherwise. This just flirting was starting to make her feel too much. Time passed imperceptibly. When the sun began to sink, there were several camps of girls who were tired from the fun. Some were still dancing below. Others were half lying down, dozing in deck chairs. Some were telling heartwarming stories about their divorces and disappointments. Wine and champagne bottles could no longer fit in the same trash can. Courtney herself, the birthday girl, had disappeared somewhere. According to the others, she had gone to take a nap, tired from the excessive toasting and dancing. The sun was setting, coloring the sky orange and pink. Jenna felt like she wanted to be alone. She quietly walked to the bow of the yacht and took off her sandals. The warm deck beneath her feet gave a pleasant feeling of freedom. Noticing that the surroundings had become empty, she sighed quietly. This day, full of fun, had suddenly turned on her in a different way, the carefree feeling replaced by a vague anxiety. She remembered the kids, remembered Nate, wondered if they were doing a good job there. But she cut those thoughts off immediately, deciding that the day was all hers. A light, almost transparent sundress was blowing in the breeze. Jenna leaned on the handrail, watching the sun gradually hide behind the horizon, leaving a golden path on the water. Suddenly, Raphael's voice sounded beside her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" She shuddered, not expecting him to appear so silently. He was barefoot, too, in shorts and an unbuttoned shirt that he slipped carelessly over his shoulders. He was holding a glass of something cool. "Yes, it's incredible," she said, trying to speak calmly. He stepped closer, handed her the glass. "It's pear cider. It's very mild, you should like it." She looked at his hand, then at the glass, and took it almost without thinking. She took a small sip, sweet sour flavor, pleasant bubbles on her tongue. I turned back to the sunset. Raphael was standing beside her, not saying a word, and in the silence there was a sudden tension between them, tight as a taut string. "Your name is Jenna, isn't it?" he asked finally. She nodded. "I'm sorry, I don't always remember guests' names," Raphael said, smiling. "But that name suits you." "Thank you," she replied briefly. She was embarrassed. They remained silent for a moment. Somewhere on the deck behind them, they heard the clinking of glasses and the muffled voices of women. The sun was sinking into the ocean, reflecting in red spots on Raphael's body. He took half a step closer to her. "Are you happy?" he asked suddenly, looking her straight in the eye. She was confused by such a direct question. Usually people ask, "How are you? Is everything all right?" But not, "Are you happy?" Is she really happy? She has a wonderful husband, kids, home, friends. But for some reason this question sticks in her heart. "Does it look like I'm unhappy?" She exhaled, unable to find a better answer. Raphael looked at her calmly, his head slightly bowed. There was something soft but determined in his eyes. Sometimes you can have everything and still feel empty. I see it sometimes in the eyes of the people on the boat. They're laughing, drinking, but inside they have dash. He paused. A storm of their own. She felt something inside her shudder. She wanted to reply that her marriage was good, that she loved children and life, but suddenly realized that at that moment it would be a lie, or at least not the full truth. A lump was rising to his throat. He reached out gingerly, touched her wrist, then, meeting no resistance, slid his fingers upward to her elbow, to her shoulder. For a moment, she saw the tendons in his wrist play as he touched her skin. She felt goosebumps, as if she'd been pierced by a light electric shock. The distance between them narrowed to a dangerous minimum. "I don't dash," she started quietly, but stammered. He waited. A gust of wind ruffled her hair. The light dress lifted. The whole world seemed to stand still. The music behind her became the background. The sunset illuminated the two of them with thin rays. She felt his hand now touching her face, his thumb touching her lips, and in that moment all the inner "no, you can't" broke. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She could have backed away, she could have pushed him away, she could have closed herself off, but she did none of those things. It was as if fate itself had taken her by the hand and led her toward the sin she so feared and which deep down perhaps she craved. He moved closer to her lips, barely touching. Jenna felt the warmth of his breath. Suddenly she decided to break the lingering pause. She reached for him first, touching her lips to his, softly, tentatively. Raphael responded, almost immediately, eagerly, but still restrained, like a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time, but was afraid of spooking him. They kissed, and for her, the whole world turned upside down in that instant. Then everything unfolded as if in a fog. The music had faded, the wine was just a background, and her companions were snoozing or laughing below, unaware that something forbidden was happening on the bow of the boat. Raphael led her gently by the hand, and she followed him as if in a dream. Her insides were on fire, every nerve throbbing with desire and fear at the same time. They were at the chaise lounge where no one could see them, protected by a low partition from the rest of the ship. Her only thought was, how? Why so fast? But burning curiosity and passionate impulse superseded all reason. He touched her hair, ran his hands around her waist, pulled her against him. She felt the coolness of the sea wind on her heated skin, and it felt incredibly sensual. There was not a shadow of doubt on his part. He acted like a man who knew how to get his way and knew what he was doing. Their kisses grew bolder, deeper. She kissed him back, and each time the thought flashed inside her that she was committing a betrayal. But along with it came a wave of arousal and passionate attraction she hadn't felt in years. The evening sky above them was ablaze with red and purple streaks. Somewhere overboard the waves were splashing. Raphael laid her down on the upholstered chaise lounge, covered her with his body, but moved gently, as if giving her the opportunity to stop everything if she wanted to. She didn't stop it. On the contrary, her hands slid down his back, pulling him closer. Her head pounded. What am I doing? I'm married. I'm a mother. But the rush of passion was stronger than all arguments. They kissed hot and salty from the sea air, and, as if in a cinematic frame, nothing existed for her but that moment. It was as if someone was watching them from above, watching the sin being committed on the deck, lit by the last rays of the sunset. Raphael kissed her neck, moving lower and lower to the neckline of her dress, and she wriggled, feeling her body shudder with every touch. When they made love, she felt as if the whole world had turned upside down. A sharp flash of desire sent a wave of ecstasy through her body. She heard her own ragged breathing, felt her hands on Raphael's shoulders. Her eyes were half closed, but the images were incredibly vivid. Reflections on the water, the orange sky, the man's warm lips, his whispers in Spanish, which she didn't understand, but which sounded like music in her ears. Mi estrella, he whispered, leaning in close to her ear. And she did not know what estrella meant. Star? Light? But she felt that he said it with tenderness and passion. She herself, for a moment, whispered to him in English. I need this. I need this. Not even fully realizing what she was saying. Raphael exhaled through clenched teeth and pressed his lips to hers. Everything was happening on the edge of her inner inhibitions, but the sensuality overwhelmed her so powerfully that she forgot about morality, forgot that somewhere at home she had a husband, 2 children, and that she had come here just to relax with her friends. That evening changed everything. The peak of their intimacy was like an explosion. She squeezed her eyes shut, digging her nails into his back to keep from screaming in ecstasy. The ocean seemed to part at that moment, leaving only the two of them between the sky and the water. Then there was silence. Raphael leaned his head on her chest, and for a while they lay like that, listening to the light wind over the sails and the warm waves slapping against the sides of the boat. She stared into the fading sunset. Only now did she begin to realize what had happened. A sharp pain was creeping into her soul, along with a sense of failure, guilt, and a surprisingly mixed tenderness for this man she barely knew. She brushed the wet strands of hair away from her forehead and took a deep breath. Raphael lifted himself up, looked at her. His face looked calm, somehow peaceful, but there was something like triumph in his eyes. Maybe he felt victorious? "This is wrong," she whispered, feeling her voice breaking. He touched her cheek. Right or wrong, it had happened. She didn't know what to say back. A lump rolled up to her throat. She wanted to cry and laugh at the same time. Finally, she sobbed quietly, wrapping her arms around her face, trying not to let it show. The man beside her didn't need to see her tears. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but in that moment she realized what she had done and that there was no going back. Morning came all too quickly. Some of her friends woke up slightly hungover. Others were still snoozing wrapped in towels. Courtney was smiling, telling everyone how great her birthday had been, how she'd blacked out for a couple hours because she'd had too much champagne. No one asked Jenna anything suspicious. Perhaps she was lucky in that most were too busy with their stories and pictures. Raphael hadn't been seen much since this morning. He'd said a brief hello, told her he'd take care of the mooring, and stood back as if it had never been personal between him and Jenna. She avoided meeting his eyes. She sat on the deck, barely taking a sip of coffee, feeling drained and yet alertly animated. It was as if some new power lived in her, but with it a deep crack in the familiar world order. When the yacht returned to port, the girls, laughing and chatting, went ashore. The party was over. No one seemed to notice that Jenna was barely alive with internal tension. She was greedily catching air with her mouth, as if there wasn't enough oxygen on deck. Her one thought was poisoned by guilt. How am I going to look Nate in the eye now? Courtney hugged her goodbye. "Why are you like this?" she asked in a low voice. "Did you get too much rest?" "I guess." Jenna grinned, trying to look tired but calm. They drove home. Jenna drove herself, though her hands shook on the steering wheel. 30 minutes on the freeway, and there she was, pulling into the quiet streets of suburban San Diego. Nate stood on the porch with the two kids, who squealed with joy when they saw their mom. Stella ran to hug her, and Joy asked, "Mom, did you bring us anything?" Jenna laughed and took him in her arms, trying to hide the wave of emotion that swept over her. She noticed immediately that there was little to no mental reserve left on her. Her strength was gone, as if burned out by the night's passion and subsequent guilt. Nate looked at her with warmth and mild curiosity. "How was the bachelorette party? I hope it went well." "Yeah, it was great," she said, trying to smile. Her voice sounded strained, but her husband didn't seem to mind. He helped her with her bags, giving her a peck on the cheek as she walked by. Jenna felt like an actress going on stage and trying to play the part of the loving, happy wife, even though inside everything was ablaze with feelings of betrayal. The kids were jumping around, inviting her to show them pictures from the yacht, but she just nodded, promising to show them later. All the rest of the day, she behaved as if on automatic. She cooked dinner, listened to how the 24 hours passed without her, pretended to be happy about how wonderful the children spent time with their father. But in the back of her mind, she already realized that something had changed in her. A strange feeling of loss, and at the same time, some kind of awakening. What will happen now? She thought, looking at her husband smile. A few days later, Jenna still couldn't return to her former serenity. Nate was still the same caring, attentive man. He made no complaints, asked no tricky questions, but she knew he was picking up on something wrong. She became more absent-minded, stared into the void, could forget what day the children's matinee was scheduled for. One night, after they put the kids to bed, Nate struck up a conversation. "Listen, honey, you've been different since you got back from that party. Is everything okay?" She looked away, feeling the loop of fear tightening inside. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just tired. Lots to do," she mumbled. He didn't seem to believe her, but he didn't insist. He nodded briefly and put his arm around her shoulders. But when he tried to kiss her neck, she shuddered, remembering that hot night. The memory flashed before her eyes. Raphael touching her lips. Her body reacted against her will. She couldn't respond to her husband as he expected. He pulled away, looking at her with bewilderment and slight resentment. "Are you all right?" he repeated again. She only nodded. Later, lying next to him, she thought, why can't I just forget it, like a random mistake? But the memories kept resurfacing, often at the most inopportune moments. The details of that evening on the yacht seemed like magic or a nightmare. She felt disgusted with herself, and at the same time, a strange, shameful pleasure when she thought of Raphael's touch. A few days later, Nate noticed the pictures from the party on Jenna's phone when she showed the pictures with Courtney. One of the pictures happened to include Raphael. He was standing on the deck, laughing. Handsome, young, swarthy. Oh, is it your captain? Handsome, Nate said casually. Yeah, she nodded, feeling her throat constrict. He entertained us, helped us, she said, trying to sound as casual as possible. Her husband noticed that her voice trembled, looked at her intently. But again, he didn't say a word. That same night, he tried to show her tenderness, to kiss her neck, but she again withdrew, citing a headache. He sensed something wrong, though he tried not to show it. The alienation was growing. It had been a week since that ill-fated or beautiful party. Jenna sat in the kitchen, running her mind over what to do about this inner storm. She realized there was no way to drive it all down. Either she had to come clean to her husband or learn to keep lying and live with the weight of it. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Usually the courier or the mailman didn't knock so loudly. She went to open it, but there was no one at the door. Just a white envelope without a stamp lying on the welcome mat. She picked it up, walked back into the house. Nate asked, "Who's there?" "No one," she replied. She opened the envelope. Inside was a postcard. On the front was a picture of a yacht against the setting sun. The same sunset that had been bugging her. On the back, just 2 words in black ink. Hasta luego. No signature, no address, no name. But she didn't have to wonder for long who it was from. Her heart thudded in her chest, as if someone had squeezed it painfully with their fingers. Raphael. Only he could do that. "What is it?" Nate asked, coming out of the living room. She frantically clutched the card to her chest and turned to him. He saw her face, pale, as if she'd seen a ghost. He came closer. She opened her arms, unable to say a word. He took the card, looked at it. The short inscription, Hasta luego, stared back at him from the page. He didn't need to know the literal translation to realize it was something like "see you later" or "see you soon." And apparently the message was addressed to his wife. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, and she looked at him. At that moment, they both understood everything, without a single question, without explanation. Something had broken in their relationship. The warm shroud of trust that had protected their family for years had collapsed. Nate shrank back as if he'd been kicked in the butt. He clenched his jaw, lowered his gaze to the floor, clutched the card in his hand. Then, as if he'd changed his mind about tearing it, he let it go, tossing it on the table. He turned around and, without a word, walked out of the kitchen, heading for the garage. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding thud. She wanted to shout something, but her throat was tight, as if she'd run out of words. She wanted to run after him, to explain. But what would she say? That it was a mistake, that she hadn't meant to, but it had happened on its own? Or that she lacked the sharpness of sensation? No excuse could heal the wound she'd inflicted. She had, in essence, betrayed his trust. Jenna remained standing there in the empty kitchen, palms pressed to her face, trying to calm the shiver that gripped her. It was several minutes before she was able to move. She picked up the card, looked at the picture of the yacht, and remembered that hot night. The tears didn't flow apparently, they had dried up inside her. Only a desperate emptiness echoed in her chest. A second later, she noticed a faint silhouette in the photograph, like 2 people hugging on the deck. She looked closer. Indeed, some romantic shot, taken perhaps by someone from another ship or from afar. And she could see that it was most likely her and Raphael, in the daylight, together. A sort of inadvertently taken photo that was now a ghost of her sin. Sighing heavily, she closed her eyes. How had Raphael gotten her address in the first place? Maybe he'd found out through Courtney, or while she was in the cabin. He'd found her purse, seen the paperwork. She didn't know, and probably never would. But the fact remained that he had sent her this parting or, on the contrary, promising message. And now her life would never be the same again. She stood at the window, looking out into the empty courtyard where the children were playing, still unaware of the storm between their parents. The picture of the yacht was in her hand, and the two words, hasta luego, a mute accusation, rose between her and the window. From behind, through the garage door, not a sound came. Nate was there, perhaps trying to regain consciousness or pounding his fist on the wall with anger. She didn't know. The last picture of this scene, Jenna standing in the empty house with that postcard, and the sun shining outside the window, the kids laughing, knowing nothing of the rift that threatens them all. She doesn't cry. She just can't. She has too many contradictions and broken feelings inside her to reflect them with ordinary tears. And she doesn't know what to do now, where to go, how to make amends, or how to live with it. The picture she managed to save on her phone was of her, Raphael, and that sunset. He was smiling, putting his arm around her shoulders, and she was looking off into the distance, a little embarrassed. It seemed like it was just a cute shot then, but now it was a symbol of her biggest mistake, or the most powerful shock of her life. She didn't know when or how it would end. But one thing she knew for sure, there was no going back. The Jenna who'd gone out on the boat as a fun-loving group of friends, a carefree mom of two, and a faithful wife had died on the deck in the sunset. And in her place, there was another woman with a broken heart and sin on her soul. And that's something we'll have to live with. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.